Hi, everybody. I'm just going to wait a minute while the people in the waiting room are filtering in, and then we'll get started. My name is Cody, and I have the privilege of welcoming you this evening to our Digital Wellbeing and Online Learning, Digital Citizenship and Education lecture. But before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet today. I personally live on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, which is also the lands on which our Parkville University of Melbourne campus is based. And when we think about today's topic, which is around learning new ways of information sharing and sharing knowledge, it's really quite humbling to think that people have met on this land for hundreds and thousands of generations to share knowledge and to tell their stories. So it's a real privilege for us to be able to continue to do the same. So I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all Indigenous peoples who may be present today. So the next part that I would like to do now is introduce one of our fabulous academics. We have Dr. Catherine Smith, who is a leading expert in the area of digital wellbeing and online learning and teaches into our Melbourne Graduate School of Education. So Catherine will be giving our keynote presentation today, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of Catherine at the end of her presentation, but please feel free to put in your questions into the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we've got a crack team in the background who'll be responding to your questions and getting them ready to put to Catherine at the end of the session as well. So Catherine, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Cody, and welcome everybody. Today's kind of discussion, and I hope that it does end with some questions and discussion, is around the experiences and the things that we do at Melbourne around looking at digital citizenship and education. And so when we think about this, I'm going to tell you a few of the projects that we work with so that you can kind of get an idea of where our kind of teaching follows through and where our research kind of sits. And should you come to the University of Melbourne, some of the things that you might get involved with as you go. So as a kind of expert in well-being and in technology, I find myself working across a lot of different projects, and I have a real interest in the way in which technology shapes our experience as students, as teachers, as lecturers, and as citizens of the world and of the internet. And so a lot of our projects kind of look at various different ways that we can partner with organizations and some familiar sorts of large businesses and smaller kind of government kind of relationships, so that we understand the broad range of policies and practices that are happening. So for one of the projects that we work with, we're looking locally in Carlton, where the university is based, at the way in which relationships between schools and between the university and between people who are working in public housing were impacted by the digital disruption that happened during COVID. And so we've been working really closely with 10 different language groups and a lot of different community partners to look at ways in which we can make sure that digital inclusion happens. We've also been looking with another project at the ways in which robots are used in classrooms, in care relationships, in hospitals, and how that changes the nature of the relationship between a patient and a carer, or a student and a teacher. And finally, we're looking at the ways in which software and other sorts of adaptations to our practice as teachers that have kind of moved into the digital space are impacting on the way in which we work and the relationships we have. And we use a lot of different media platforms, and we understand the changing nature of literacy around media. And so a lot of our projects are around that. So to kind of explain a little further some of the questions that might come along with this and some of the ponderings that exist, there's a real concern in Australia and across the globe, in fact, about what we saw in the COVID kind of times of disruption and continuing on in terms of who has access to the internet and who has access to technology and who doesn't. And for schools in Australia, we were, surprised to find out that there were a large number of families and students who didn't have the access we expected in the internet. Or, in terms of having enough computers at home for everybody to get on. So we found that we had a big divide between students that could continue their education while we were locked down and those that couldn't. But on top of that sort of a divide, which was really defined by COVID, we know that there's a growing digital divide between those people that can afford the internet, those people that can access and know how to access that technology, and those people who have the abilities and capabilities of working with computers and understanding how to kind of set things up. And we understand that there are people that are left out and left behind. So that digital divide becomes a real social justice issue that we're also thinking about. And so in terms of that, we start to kind of think about the relationships that we can build between each other to address some of these issues. And we find that a lot of the things that we can highlight and that we find working in our research are often really localized solutions. So despite the fact that the internet is hugely kind of connected and part of our globalization experience in education, when it came to actually sorting out the access that people required in terms of making sure that their phones worked to get their vaccination certificates on and all of those little things, it was back to local government and local kind of situations in schools and in different places where people who didn't understand the technology or didn't have the access came to kind of get help. And so we saw a return of relationships of schools and relationships of like different places of learning to really kind of helping us solve and connect people that were disconnecting through the digital divide. So as you kind of think about the way in which we, are working with schools and working with people and the role of schools in technology, these are the areas that we continue to kind of consider in terms of what the future of education and what the future of the role of schools in these different situations might be. Now, I'm sure that, that all sounds really rosy and it's great that we're doing that, but we also know that as we kind of consider the work in classrooms and schools, we've seen the headlines about the ways in which teachers and the ways in which students really didn't thrive in the online teaching experience. And in that what, is referred to often as a pivot to online learning, as well as kind of those people that were left behind, there was a real disconnect of relationships. And in research that we've done around kids with disability and, kids with other situations that might lead them to not be as connected to school as others, there was a real disengagement that occurred as well. We know in those situations, particularly for those kids that are at risk of disconnecting from school, that one of the main protective factors are teacher-student relationships. And so another part of the research that we're doing and thinking about is really thinking about and teaching around how to build those relationships within the online spaces that we're teaching in and learning in, because those will become part of our lived experience. And even now, the policies and practices of work and of study are changing as people have found a flexibility that in some ways they enjoyed, just maybe not all the time in some cases. And so thinking a bit about what that looks like is the work of research and researchers and learners and teachers over the next and coming sorts of times of education in the next kind of 5 to 10 years. There's a lot of talk about the dangers of long-term connection on the internet, and we certainly found ourselves, many of us, experiencing Zoom fatigue and all sorts of kind of exhaustion around having to connect and reconnect and be on screens all day. And there's a lot of research that looks at the well-being around how to manage your digital lives. But there's also a lot of concerns around young people. And so we've seen globally, in terms of policy, some countries like China, for example, who have made really solid laws around protecting young people from too much time on screens and too much time gaming, whereas other countries take different approaches. And so as the research develops, we start to kind of watch what those impacts are. What we do know on this side is that there were real concerns around the ways in which people connect and find connections are manipulated by certain social media platforms. And so there's a certain amount of concern around how we as students, as teachers, manage this on behalf of our learning in classrooms and our school populations, and what we do to kind of support that and teach best practice. When there are also concerns, as you can see in some of these pictures, about that lack of human connection that comes with extended amounts of time living isolated and only connecting on screens. The other kind of considerations that come around this that might interest you in terms of education are the things about data and surveillance. Now, I've been in teaching for over 30 years, so I remember when our main concerns around surveillance were cameras and what data we were collecting there. But now we have enormous amounts of data that often cross geographical boundaries and are stored in various places that give quite detailed information about our students. So questions around the surveillance and the ethics around what we store, what we collect, how we collect it, and what we are kind of allowing our students to opt into and out of are really important, as are for teachers and for lecturers, their opportunities to control their intellectual property around what they teach and that information as well. And so these are all questions that kind of come after a lot of the practice already happens. And what we find across multiple sorts of rollouts of technology, whether we're looking at robotics or apps or other technology, is that often the market moves ahead of our legislation and our ability to kind of protect our citizens and make informed decisions that are already kind of identifying where the risk might be. And so as a result, there's often damage done before we can kind of address that. So here's an example of one of these things. You know, facial recognition is a huge question around the globe, and governments use it in different ways. But recently, you know, in questioning this, one of the ways that schools were using facial recognition was quite, you know, not even really thought in terms of kind of the academic work of schools. It was thought about how we would speed up lunch queues. So in some countries, all kids kind of buy or are on lists that kind of their lunch is provided in schools. And so rather than kind of have to go up and pay or go up and kind of identify with their cards that they're a free lunch student. Instead, the facial recognition software would just kind of say, okay, this person's paid, this person's paid, this person doesn't have to pay. And it would just move people up so that they could move through quickly. But what concerns happen there are that many people are not interested in having those sorts of images stored of themselves. And people go through great effort to protect themselves from having those images shared. But what we hear from academics like Paglionia from Deakin is that you know, students often find their information shared by their schools when they had no idea that that would happen. And they have very little control or understanding of who has shared that information or how it's gotten there or how to ask for it to get back. So when we think about what we're teaching, there's a little bit of concern in the literature and, you know, that we're looking at in terms of research around what we're teaching students about their ability to control their profile, their digital identity, and what role they have as citizens. And we, there are concerns arisen by different people around how there's a learned helplessness almost when you kind of face the people who are supposed to be there to protect you and have the answers around these things, and they're not able to kind of interact or kind of fix your issue or even kind of point you in the right direction. So that sort of work around help seeking in this area becomes something that we also really want to empower people to do. So in terms of the other powers of digital technologies, because while there's lots of warnings around these things, there are so many affordances that have occurred. And while there was certainly during the pandemic and since then, for those that are still socially isolated, a real affordance that was given to us by being able to connect, through Zoom and find ways to kind of connect with people and still maintain relationships. Additionally, there are all sorts of ways in which we bridge some of the divides that exist for people who have additional functional needs for their learning and their education that technology, provides. And so while this is another learning and things that we have to learn as teachers and teach as teacher educators, there's an enormous amount of opportunity to address things that have long kind of stood in the way for some people around being able to read or hear, being able to use speech to text, being able to use particular technologies to assist in dealing with some of the distractions that might exist for people with auditory processing disorders or neuroatypicalities. So we really kind of think about the ways in which we have to balance the two in these sorts of situations, and where indeed is the agency for people to decide where they can and can't opt out of these things in education. Now, in thinking about this in the world and across the kind of spectrum of different policies, we do see a situation where different models of digital citizenship are starting to appear. Now, the one that you're seeing here is the DQ model. It was originally formulated in Singapore, but is being adopted really widely across the globe in all sorts of interesting and different ways. And the relationships that exist around these things making their way into schools are not always as straightforward as you'd think. A teacher deciding to use it, or a government deciding to make things part of the curriculum, and so it rolls down that way. Often there are all sorts of other relationships that exist between multinational corporations and the ways in which they're partnered with particular arms of the government that make certain decisions around policy that then, create relationships between particular models. But in terms of actually addressing what's in the model, we can see that in terms of a digital citizen, there's also a sense of, instead of just the safety and the cyber safety that originally controlled this space, we're moving towards also thinking about how students take responsibility, and we as citizens take responsibility for our behavior online, for our well-being, and the balance that we find in engaging with technology for addressing and dealing with issues or problems where somebody else is at risk. So all of the social emotional skills that we teach in classrooms and in schools and in playgrounds are now also part of the work that we do in online relationships with students, and helping them to kind of navigate and develop the sorts of literacies and boundaries that they need to in order to move forward with their lives and enjoy the affordances of the digital space, while also, taking care of themselves more broadly. Now, there are all sorts of tools that exist in the world that kind of tell us how to do things online. And in the way of memes and other kind of things that we can cut and paste off the internet, we often adopt things very quickly. And so part of our work as teacher educators, as teachers, and ultimately as anyone working in education, is also to develop for ourselves as well as our students a sense of both media and digital literacy, and being able to kind of identify the sources of information and how those kind of sources of information and tools that we use on the internet are actually informed in terms of the ethics and the values that we hold, and how those might kind of then be reflected in the experiences that we're giving our students. So often when we think about computational thinking and the things that we actually teach in computer science classes and technology and digital classes, with coding, while we don't expect all our students to become coders, there's a lot of strength in having people understand how code is part of the decision-making process within software, within apps, and within robotics and technology, and how those ultimately are decisions that are made well before the end user actually comes across the technology. And so how we as educators and as leaders in education fields make decisions and inform ourselves and critique and become critical of those technologies are really important skills. And so while we think a little bit about teaching about the technology and what's out there, it's also really important that we start to develop frameworks that help us to make those sorts of decisions and to question the materials that we come across. There's a lot of when I first started teaching, there was a great deal of sort of, when teachers were exhausted, they would stick on a film, and I'll tell you how old I was because those were films that kind of rolled through projectors and we had screens. But there's a lot of kind of the opportunity now to use an app or to stick, a game or a simulation in front of students. And sometimes because we're busy and we don't really kind of have a lot of time to do that, it becomes kind of something that we do off the cuff. We find it on the internet, it looks great, cursory kind of glance, and then we include it. And more we're starting to kind of see that that's not always the best policy. There are all sorts of things that kind of lurk. And we want our students to feel safe on the internet, but we also want them to be able to kind of do their own sort of explorations and things in safe spaces. So there's a lot of movement and a lot of consideration about how we do that. And a lot of it fails. A lot of it, you can come up with lots of examples across different governments in Australia around ways in which they've tried to control spaces, digital spaces for students that have ended up really kind of failing. And so a lot of the current kind of approach is thinking more about how do we allow students to develop those skills that we're talking about developing in teachers to help them kind of make those decisions themselves around what feels safe and what doesn't. And there's a lot of work to decide where the ages are right, and where we start to kind of have those discussions. And a lot of them, stem back to the same sorts of conversations we have about any sort of well-being situation, whether we're talking about sex education or any other sort of situation where there's a potential for harm to be done. And so we need to kind of mitigate risk. And so these are other things that you might want to think about, and you will kind of end up studying in this area as we kind of move forward. Now, there's a lot, of questions too about the balance that exists in people's lives around technology. And a lot of us kind of gave up lunch breaks, and as we started to work online, we found there was an efficiency to that without the hour-long sort of commutes or whatever it was that kind of began and ended our days. I know lots of people had to kind of lose some weight to get back into their trousers and clothes when we started to kind of move back into the workplace, because a lot of people kind of relaxed a bit and didn't put on that same clothes, so they suddenly found themselves having expanded a bit. There's all sorts of implications to balance between living digitally and living in person, and that's not just in terms of the way in which we kind of find ourselves embodied in our own, in our own form, but also our relationship with the natural world and sustainability and the ways in which those sorts of things continue. And we are always kind of thinking of new ways to do that and new ways to address the other impacts, in terms of sustainability that our rise in digital use has kind of brought about. All of the servers and other kind of technology that works alongside of this has an impact as well on the energy that we burn, on the materials that we use, and often we kind of make decisions around this that need to be considered in terms of how we sustain and how we're taking care of the planet and the earth as well. So there's also questions around that to consider. Now, in terms of the work from home, I already mentioned that sort of notion of boundaries and how, we started to kind of go it, like, instead of starting our day when we would, after we'd commuted, we started working at the same time as we would get in the car to commute. And we don't have that sort of variation or movement of bodies and things. But there's also considerations for us in terms of our relationships as teachers, our relationships as students. We've seen a real exodus that's sped up since kind of moving to digital spaces from the teaching profession. And we need to think a little bit about how we balance our lives in digital spaces, but also, importantly, how we use digital technology to help us balance that as well. And so there's a lot of skills and work that we can do around helping teachers and teacher candidates and people who are already kind of working in the field, and developing programs for students as well, that look at the ways in which we can build skills for well-being and build skills for social and emotional kind of responses within the digital space. And so that's another important area of kind of considering our work. Now, in every sort of classroom where we bring technology in, there's always a kind of balancing of thinking about what are the possible good consequences and what are the challenges that exist. And one of the things that that kind of appears in the literature about using robots in classes is one that has always struck me as unlikely to have been seen before it actually occurred. So Sherry Turkle writes about using robots in a classroom, and she has robots that are working particularly with kids with disability, and keeping kids kind of engaged in what are pretty repetitive tasks. And often what we see in pedagogical relationships between teachers and students who have the need to kind of repeat things and have the need to kind of have the same stimulus again and again in order to kind of proceed through their learning is a sense of frustration that exists when there are multiple kind of demands and it seems like that's not moving ahead. So one of the things that robots are often used for in pedagogical relationships is to do some of that work that is a bit more sort of repetitive and allows for one-to-one sort of response giving to a student without kind of interrupting the broader flow of the classroom. But one of the things that kind of happens when you have that sort of a relationship, or actually many of the things that happen when you have that sort of a relationship, are often to do with the ways in which not just that student, but also the broader community responds to that technology. And in the case of robots, what we found, particularly with young children, was that young children didn't understand that the robot wasn't making decisions itself. And so often the robot would only respond to the one student, or it wouldn't interact with other students in the same way that it responded to that student. But what young people kind of came away from, and the children kind of described to researchers after, was that they felt that the robot didn't like them, or they didn't really want to kind of be with them, or there was something wrong with them that kind of was impacting on that work. So when we think about the kind of consequences that happen in their relationships with technology, there's a lot to consider about how we teach kids as we bring those kind of technologies into the class, about their limitations as well. Now, having said that, as robots get smarter and the ways in which we kind of see them developing more advanced systems for learning and for different artificial intelligences that kind of exist, they become more lifelike, and in some cases can develop quite a relational response to people. And so then concerns kind of exist, particularly when we work often with people who are more vulnerable within these relationships between robots and humans, where we kind of have our boundaries existing around having people understand the limitations of the robot and the fact that the robot isn't indeed kind of a human being. And what happens with all technology, we get a certain planned obsolescence. What happens when relationships and care relationships have come to develop deeply within these sorts of systems? And then the technology fails or can no longer be updated. And we can no longer kind of maintain that level of support for that person. So there are lots of kind of complications and things we need to consider in simulations as we work towards making decisions about the ways in which we bring technology into the classroom. And so this would be another sort of area of potential interest for thinking about digital spaces and well-being and technologies within your studies of education. Now, finally, we know that we really want to maintain teacher digital well-being. So in both our kind of education courses in the well-being stream and in our teacher education courses, we do teach specific skills to our teacher candidates as well for thinking about how they maintain their own digital well-being. And this is, of course, a moving space, but there's lots of things that we know from research already that are really important to inform both policymakers and to inform school leaders and to inform teachers as they kind of move through their work that actually kind of address and help with their well-being. So we know that to be a well teacher in digital spaces, it's important to have some agency in the choices that we make about the technologies that we are using, and that not all technology is fit for purpose for every classroom relationship. And, when you teach for a while, you realize that you can have the same class, but you have to deliver it completely differently to different cohorts of students. And the same thing exists when you're talking about choice of technologies. Some people will work really well in a Zoom space and then go off and they'll have really deep conversations within, Zoom breakout rooms, but others will just sit silently in breakout rooms because they don't have the comfort or they haven't engaged with the materials enough to really work with that. So we have to make different decisions around what we use, and having choices becomes really important for maintaining our relationships and meeting our kind of obligations and learning objectives for our students as well. So we need to kind of continue to offer opportunities and understanding of how to continue to gain and practice digital skills throughout our lifetime. And As a kind of former technology teacher in a school, there's a level of professional development that exists across the spectrum as people have come to understand technology in different ways. And there's a certain level of resistance within the community and for certain other people for different reasons. So we need to think a little bit about how those relationships set within that as well. For some people, not understanding how security and privacy is ensured is really important. And so both teachers and students need to feel safe in the spaces that they're sharing. And that goes back to some of the thinking about surveillance and where our data sits and what are the risks and how we kind of make those systems more transparent for all of the members of our teaching and learning community. When we lean on digital kind of communication, in particular in school communities, we know now after the pandemic kind of first lockdowns that there are certain people that just aren't getting that information. So for a long time, in some schools, they've moved their newsletters and their kind of permission slips and things online. But now, knowing what we know about some families having really intermittent access to digital spaces, and the kind of complications around debt that can build up around poorly chosen or poorly kind of allocated technology plans that kind of preclude people from getting involved with the internet or having access to the internet, can be really complicated for some students in terms of getting information to their parents or to themselves around homework and things. So we need to kind of also think about how we address that and what it means in terms of teacher digital well-being. When we have two cohorts at once, what we're calling blended learning right now, and how we allow ourselves kind of the latitude to understand that we can't be in both places at once, how we kind of manage those relationships and expectations and create boundaries for ourselves and our students around kind of meeting their learning needs, while also not extending ourselves to the point where we end up too exhausted or with compassion fatigue and no longer able to do the work that we're assigned to. So I could go on and on about all the different kinds of questions and research that exist in this space and the ways in which we work with and are supporting students here in this space around education and technology. But it would be great if I could respond to any questions you might have or anything that you'd like to discuss further as we kind of move to the Q&A part of this session. So Cody, I'll hand it back to you.
Lovely, Catherine. Thank you so much. That was really, really so valuable to understand where we're at right now. I think the knowledge that you've been building for years and years has just become apparent to so many people about how important it is to understand not just switching what you do in a classroom into on a computer. It's a totally different way of learning. We did have a couple of questions about that and about the different kinds of students that you might come across in an online classroom. If you're getting someone that's just not engaging with you, they're not turning their screen on, they're not interacting in an online classroom, what are some ways that you can work with these students? How are you finding that you can overcome those barriers to really engage with people in this kind of platform?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of ways in which we can address that. And it's important when we think about kind of people not engaging to return back to that notion of the digital divide, and understanding whether that lack of interaction is because the bandwidth is too expensive and they can't kind of turn on their cameras, or, there's unstable internet, or maybe there's something in their house they're not comfortable having you see. Like, there's lots of reasons why people don't turn on cameras. And, even I, who work in technology, the laptop that I use doesn't have one of those kind of filters on it that allows for a background to be used. So, there's often kind of moments where cats and dogs and other things appear in my picture. And so, there are all sorts of reasons why people don't engage in that way. But it's really important for us to consider the affordances around, asynchronous learning as well. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is the way in which we can use gaming and simulations to give people a shared experience, even if they're all over the globe, you know, around kind of, you know, having to make decisions and work through a particular conundrum, or playing, you know, in a particular space and gaining a skill that way, or making decisions around an interaction that help people kind of counsel students through difficult decisions and things. There are simulations for all of these things that can create a shared experience, but not in real time, that different students can access at their kind of ability. So I know that a number of our students kind of use public Wi-Fi in order to save money. And so they, you know, they'll find somewhere to connect, but that means that they'll connect at odd times and you know, at different moments. So allowing that flexibility, but then having the conversation either through, you know, a kind of all sorts of different ways. You can do that through like a chat board, or through, you know, different kind of film settings, or even just kind of waiting till you do have a synchronous moment in class and having a discussion about that then often creates a real connection that isn't to be ignored. There's a lot of affect that exists in kind of those gaming and simulation experiences. And with that kind of comes a lot of connection and a lot of thinking and a lot of kind of that embodied part of teaching that we sometimes miss when we're not in the classroom. The other thing that I find is when you start to break down those boundaries and talk a little bit explicitly about what is missing, you can start to kind of identify where you would normally, as a teacher, be able to pick up certain things about students that you don't necessarily pick up when you can't see them. So, you know, as a teacher, after a while, you realize that you know your students are well when they kind of walk into the room and they're interacting and they sit down and they get their books ready and everything like that. And then there's a contrast when they don't do that, you know, and they come in and they sit down and they make their body smaller, and you can kind of watch it happen, and you know that's a student you need to check in on. And that often doesn't happen in class. In class, people perform, but it's those moments when people enter the room or when everybody's leaving that you kind of see who doesn't talk to somebody else on the way out and all that sort of thing that kind of helps you to understand where you might need to be adding extra support. It doesn't happen the same way in the digital space, and it's something that we have to be really aware of in our work in kind of well-being. But we can have conversations about the fact that that's not working. And sometimes this allows us to explicitly teach some things that we haven't always taught in the same way, and allows students to become more aware of their own, you know, their own cues and ways in which they're kind of feeling. So, so that sort of work is also kind of really, really valuable in that way.
Thank you, Catherine. We've had a couple of questions come in. There's one that I think I might just wait a moment. There's one that's just come in from an international student who's listening right now, saying that they've got their first online seminar soon and they're a bit nervous. I totally understand this, especially when they're meeting a new group of people. What if this person, being international, can't understand what others in the room are saying, or what if they can't express themselves properly? What advice would you give to students going into a new situation like that?
That is such a common thing, and it's one of the things that's really challenging when you're an international student, and I was an international student too, so I really feel this. And you're working in a language that isn't your first language, you're always really concerned about that practice. And because you're offshore, you don't have the same opportunity to hear the new language or the second language all the time. So you don't develop the same sorts of skills as you would if you get to be here and kind of have to interact all day in that language. So, you know, what's really important is kind of thinking about ways in which you can take agency in augmenting that as you go. You know, there's nobody expecting that to be kind of perfect. We don't expect anybody to kind of, you know, be able to do that first off. And everybody's nervous. It doesn't matter what language you're speaking in. When you start to kind of see yourself on screen and do that sort of thing, everybody's kind of, you know, trying to figure out where they fit and what they do. It's exactly the same in classrooms, you know, at school as it is here. But there's a lot we can do to support that. one of the beautiful things about kind of the internet and recording our classes is that you can play them on different speeds too. So if you don't catch it the first time, you can always replay. And a lot of us, if we know that you would like it, are really happy to release just the audio of our classes. And that's really useful as kind of a podcast experience. And I know that a number of my students kind of will play their classes over again as they're kind of walking or traveling and stuff, so that they can kind of pick up on the information that they've missed. We're really quite aware of where we have large cohorts of students that are not using English, are not English first language students. And so we do try and provide a lot of support around that. But we also will always ask you if there are things we can do. As a Newfoundlander and a Canadian, so I'm not Australian by birth either, I talk very fast. So I often remind my students to just let me know if I need to slow down so that they can kind of understand me better. And we're all really open to that. So please don't feel like you should not interact. Take a go and have some fun. If you don't feel confident to speak, we all use the chat function, so you can always just add your comments in the chat as well. And reach out to your tutor or your professors and let them know, where you're at in your journey and what would best help you. We're all really centered around our student experience, and as one of the directors of student experience, I really do kind of promise that we're here to listen and help and make sure that your experience gives you all the access that everybody else has to the learning objectives that we set for you and that you have for yourself.
That's great. Thank you, Catherine. So even the people who are joining us here who are thinking about studying to become teachers will be both students and teachers in the near future. So that's very helpful. The very last question I'm going to ask, we've had a couple in a similar theme around boundaries. You've mentioned it a couple of times throughout the presentation where people are sitting at a computer for many hours. Maybe the students are asking questions all throughout the day and night and expecting a response. Maybe you're working through your lunch break. How do you teach the students who are going to become teachers to set some boundaries for themselves?
Yeah. Look, it's been very interesting for us as educators in the university over the last couple of years because we had to find our own new boundaries as well. And as teachers, there's very different expectations from one school to another about how much you respond and when you respond to emails, to text messages, to various kind of demands from not just your students, but also their parents and various other kind of stakeholders within the journey of the work that you're at. We do explicitly teach about that, and we find it really important to help you kind of find the way that works for you. Now, everybody brings a certain history, to their way of being, and everybody responds and deals with conflicts and things in different ways. So we will always present a range of options for you to kind of look at the research and find the different things that are suggested in the research that work so that you can find the thing that works best for you. And in terms of setting boundaries, it's really important for you to know what you need first, and then to kind of communicate that to classes. I have not always been good at this, so I speak to this with, with my kind of proud little hat back on, and I kind of say, one thing I've learned is if I tell my students in advance, I'm never going to answer your emails on a Sunday. I keep that day kind of free. Even when I teach that course on a Sunday, the other Sundays of the year, I don't respond to emails. Then that's set in stone. And you have a certain responsibility in that too. If you have problems kind of keeping deadlines, one of the things you need to do is to create some false deadlines for yourself so that if you run into trouble, you have time to get in contact with someone before a deadline. So you're not kind of looking for an extension at the last minute in these things. But we're here to work through that together. And part of you learning that and part of us working with that is a really important part of the skills you bring into your own teaching and your own classrooms as well. So we, you know, as we kind of find ourselves in new spaces and sharing our personal and private, you know, spaces with our classroom spaces through, you know, Zoom and this sort of situation, you know, we find ourselves kind of all in that boat. So we'll work on that together. Now, there's all sorts of power dynamics around that too, that we would discuss in greater detail when you come and study with us.
Excellent. That's a great hook. Catherine, thank you so much for taking the time today to share your knowledge. You're obviously very passionate, knowledgeable, and very warm on this topic as well. I think it would be very encouraging to anyone thinking about becoming a teacher and studying this, and then be able to share it with their students in the future. So thank you for your time. Thank you for everybody who's joined us in the session, and for everyone who's watching this on video afterwards. We appreciate all your questions. And we encourage you, if you have any further questions, to sign up for a one-on-one appointment with one of our recruitment team members who'd be happy to talk to you about the courses that we have in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. And we wish you well with your future studies. Thanks, everybody.
If you have any questions for me, you can reach me to Educate for Equity on Twitter. And you can also find me on Find an Expert on the Melbourne University website. Thanks,
Excellent.
Cody.
Thank you.